Hi guys, I'm back. So back in Romans chapter 8, we are still looking into. I'm going to look at verses 18 through 30 today. In our last passage, Paul taught that suffering is part of our inheritance as children of God. That was in Romans 8 verse 17. He's been teaching that when we begin to know Christ, we cease being slaves to sin and start being slaves to righteousness. So we've gone through all of that. But now in Romans 8:18 through 30, Paul goes on to talk more about suffering on earth as a Christian. He says that creation itself is waiting along with us to be set free from its bondage and corruption and obtain the freedom promised to the children of God. So it's not just us, it's the whole world. It's creation itself, which, if you remember, that's how he started this whole book, was looking at creation and knowing there's a God, right? It's enough to condemn you when you say there is no God, because you can look out the window and know there is a God. But anyway, that's besides the point. Paul paints this picture of all the world in a state of waiting. We're all waiting anxiously for the final step in our adoption by God, which Paul describes as the redemption of our bodies, or our glorified bodies. Because although we have the initial deposit of the Holy Spirit within us, dwelling in us, bearing witness to us that we are indeed the children of God, our adoption is not finalized until we are with him in glory. So Paul says something interesting here in Romans 8:24. He says, "Who hopes for what he sees?" I remember being a young Bible reader and studier and dwelling on this passage probably, I don't know how many years ago, almost 30 probably. But it reminds us that there is something out there far bigger and far better waiting for us. Hope itself is imperative for our human spirit, especially in the midst of many hardships, trials, sufferings that we are sure to go through, that our Father calls us to face on earth. So sometimes it's just really hard to believe that God has a better awaiting, because, well, we, as Paul says, can't see it. We wouldn't have to need hope if we could see what was there ahead of us. But he quickly appeals to our doubt, and he says, but who hopes for what he sees? Hope is a product of faith, right? My dad, he used to play music and guitar and stuff, and one of his favorite songs was "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" In the chorus line of that song, if you know it, it says there's a better home awaiting in the sky, right? We're waiting for that glory. But fortunately, we're not alone in our troubles before getting to glory here on earth. Paul says in verse 26 that we have a helper, and that helper is the Holy Spirit. When we don't even know how to pray or what to pray, he prays for us. He intercedes for us. And the results of the Holy Spirit's prayers on behalf of God's people is goodness. Now, just as a side note here, some people get caught up in this passage and they talk all about, speaking in tongues and the Holy Spirit and all these other languages and prayer languages and all of these things. Honestly, I don't see that here. Not saying, I've never experienced that myself. I don't see that in this passage. I see the Holy Spirit making up for where we are weak and praying for us. If you got something different, let me know. But moving on, Paul says that all things, every single thing that happens here on earth to believers, good or bad, works together for our good. Once again, sometimes a hard thing to believe, because in the middle of suffering, we often have trouble seeing how any of it could possibly have an ultimate end result labeled good, right? Because there's a lot of bad things here on earth that happen. But God does not disappoint us. One day we will see everything clearly, and he promises that. Faith and hope are what we must live in and by until that day. So that's what faith is. It's believing that God has something for us, even when we can't see it, even when everything seems so difficult down here on this third rock from the sun, right? But Paul wraps up this message with a ribbon, which tells his readers how redemption really works. Listen to his words. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. Romans 8:29 and 30. So God knew his children prior to our birth. He himself pre-planned for us to be saved and to be adopted as his own. He determined before birth that we would be like Jesus. We would be conformed to his likeness in our thoughts, words, and deeds here on earth. And we, if we are his, are not only predestined to know and love him, but we are also called by him, justified by him, and ultimately will be glorified by him. So it's a package deal. You don't get one of those things without the other. It's really good news, really, because you can't just be saved and not called to do something good for the glory of God, not justified from, your sin, not glorified in the end. It's all a one-time deal, right? It's all a package deal. So that's good news. So Paul goes on to say, who can be against us, right? Who can be against us if God is for us? And he'll go on in the following verses to talk about that. But who can be against us, right? Because they're only going to find themselves fighting against God. This was his idea. Our salvation, our sanctification, our time here on earth, and all of the things that encompasses, good and bad, those are all part of God's will. He predetermined these things before we were ever born. So those who would oppose us, they're just going to be fighting against the will of God, because this is of him. Our existence and our lives on earth are of God, in the will of God, if we're believers. So more on that next time when we look at Romans 8:31 through 39. Hope that was helpful, and you guys have a good day.